Thank you. My name is Malcolm Haines, and I'm involved in AS400 marketing for IBM UK. During the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like us to take a look at the ideas behind AS400 and to see why it is that AS400 is different from anything else that IBM makes, or for that matter, that anybody else makes. And the reasons for that are all found in AS400's architecture. And so step by step, we shall be looking at AS400's architecture and the way in which AS400 is optimized for the general business environment in a way that no other machine is. Don't switch off when you hear the word architecture, because this isn't going to be a dry technical discussion, not by any stretch of the imagination. Next, we shall take a look at the things that make AS400 special. These are the 5 fundamental architectural features of AS400. Remember that we are looking at AS400's architecture not for dry academic reasons, but because the answer to the question, how safe is my investment in a computer system, depends fundamentally on that system's architecture. The architecture of a system is in some ways similar to the foundation of a house. You can have 2 houses that appear at first sight to be identical, and you might say there's nothing much to choose between them. And that is precisely why you need to do things like check the foundations. One house might have foundations that are 2 meters deep, and the other house might have foundations that are just 2 centimeters deep. Both houses appear to be the same today, but what happens when you start to add things? This would be the equivalent on a computer system to adding new programs that need more processing power or more storage, or adding applications such as voice, or image, or artificial intelligence. The house with the deep foundations, that's the AS400, is fine. But let's take a look at the other house. Oh dear me, it has collapsed in a heap. Obviously, you can add applications to machines other than an AS400, but to achieve the same level of functionality that you can achieve rapidly on an AS400 will cost you more, in terms of complexity, in terms of technical resource requirements, and in terms of maintenance effort. The 5 fundamental architectural principles of AS400 are these, and we shall take a look at them now one by one. First, the high-level machine. What we mean by that is that AS400 is unusual in that it is not defined by hardware like most machines are, it is defined by software. Now what do we mean by that? Suppose you have a program here. A program, as you know, is a set of instructions that tells the machine what it is to do. This program presents its instructions to the yellow interface here, known as the machine interface, thinking that it is the AS400. But there is no hardware on Earth today that understands the instructions presented to this interface. Those instructions have to undergo a further process of translation carried out by what we call licensed internal code, what we used to call microcode, before the hardware, which is appropriately blue at the bottom here, understands what is going on. Now, there are several million lines of microcode on an AS400. I need to say a few words about microcode because microcode is a concept that I know is new to some people. Everybody nowadays is familiar with the concepts of hardware and software, but microcode is neither hardware nor software. I look on it as a sort of underwear, and the purpose of the underwear is to protect you and your software from changing hardware characteristics. Everybody knows nowadays that hardware technology is changing extremely rapidly, and that hardware that, say, 25 years ago would have filled a squash court will today fit into the belly button of a fruit fly. And what this design principle means is that as the hardware technology changes, IBM commits to absorbing fluctuations in those hardware characteristics in the licensed internal code so as to preserve the same machine interface. And remember that as far as the customer is concerned, there has been no change whatsoever to the machine, because his programs continue to speak to the machine interface, which is at a high level in the machine, and therefore unaffected by changes in the hardware. This is an extremely important point because most of a customer's investment is in this part of the system, the application software, and in the training of the people that use that application software. There is another important consequence of this. The operating system, remember that's the part of the machine that does the housekeeping, resides in this part of the system. And by moving many of the programs that normally reside in the operating system into the licensed internal code, we can improve performance. Licensed internal code, because it is closer to the silicon, runs faster than programs at a higher level in the machine. So any application programs that use items that we have shifted into licensed internal code will realize a performance gain. I won't bore you to death with a list of the things that we've moved into the licensed internal code, but one example would be the routines that help us access the database. These are implemented largely in licensed internal code. Also, the routines that handle security. These are implemented totally in licensed internal code, and this makes sense not only from the performance point of view, because obviously you are using security all the time. If you ask to access a file, the system must first check that you are allowed to access that file, and then it must check to see precisely what it is that you're permitted to do having got to the file. So it makes sense from the performance point of view, but, and more importantly perhaps, it also makes sense from the security point of view, because it means that the programs responsible for security are not a set of modules that could potentially be identified and maybe fooled around with by someone clever. These routines are hidden in the depths of the machine. So, to summarize, the first architectural principle, the high-level machine, gives you hardware independence and improved performance. Now we move on to the second concept, object orientation. Object orientation is the weirdest of the 5 concepts. Object orientation is now what structured programming used to be in the 1970s. Everybody claimed to have it, and everybody meant slightly different things by it. So let's take a look at what we mean by object orientation. As this is a weird concept, I think I will use an analogy. It is of a boatload of bananas birthing. This is not an AS400. This represents an ordinary machine without object orientation. The bananas represent the bytes or the data, and the dockers are the instructions. For example, here we see some dockers carrying bananas. This represents data being moved by the machine. Now, if we look closely at this picture, we see something most interesting. Here is a docker who is about to eat a banana, and over here is a docker who is about to slip up on a banana. These 2 dockers illustrate a very important technical point, and that is that things are being done to our data that we do not want to have done to our data. Now this is an AS400. This crane represents the vastly improved instruction set optimized for the commercial environment, and this container here represents an object. All the bananas are in here, and on the front of the container is a packing slip saying these are bananas, store at 5 degrees centigrade. What we're trying to say by all this is this. Everything on AS400 is known as an object. Anything you can relate to is an object. A program is an object, a file is an object, a message queue is an object, and all objects have 2 parts to them, a descriptive part and a functional part. The descriptive part tells the machine what it is that it can do to the functional part. For example, the machine might come up to an object here and say, "What is this?" And the descriptive part may say, "This is a file." In which case, in here, as the functional part, you will have data. And obviously you can write something to the middle of data if you wished. Now suppose that the machine comes up to another object. It again says to the descriptive part of the object, "What is this?" The descriptive part may say this time, "This is a program." In which case, in here, as the functional part, you will have executable code or instructions for the machine. And obviously that executable code would be treated quite differently from the data we spoke about just now. You certainly cannot write stuff into the middle of executable code, or if you do, the processor will get very excited when it comes to execute it later on. So here we are saying something very, very important. What object orientation means is this. Inseparable from the data is a list of valid ways of using that data. And obviously there is an integrity implication in this. People used to find integrity very boring. They used to say, well, we assume all machines have integrity, don't they? Well, they don't. And integrity used to be very boring until computer viruses came along. Viruses tend to be a feature of some open systems, such as PC-DOS systems, where clever people who know how to access forbidden areas of low disk can introduce viruses that will replicate themselves and entertain us or maybe wipe out our business. With this type of design on AS400, we are saying that viruses would be very, very, very difficult to introduce. In fact, I would go further than that, and I would say impossible. I would say that AS400 avoids viruses in the same way that everyone avoids viruses. AS400 avoids viruses through practicing safe hex. And in Rochester, Minnesota, they have been practicing safe hex since 1978. And the consequences of practicing safe hex are numerous. As well as integrity, program maintenance is made much easier. And also the writing of knowledge-based systems where you represent knowledge as objects is much, much easier on an object-oriented system than on one that isn't. So object orientation gives you the following. It gives you effective security and integrity, and it also gives you a strong foundation for emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And now the third concept. The third concept is single-level storage. Some people call this single-level addressability. Whatever you call it, this is what we mean by it. AS400, like all machines today, uses two types of storage technology. Main storage that is on cards, like this, and disk storage, like this. And as is true of all machines, before programs can be executed or data can be modified, they must be copied from disk storage to main storage. Now what is special about AS400 is that if IBM were to bring out a new disk technology, for example this disk here, that is physically much smaller than the other ones, but which holds 10 times the amount of data, then the customer is not required to be aware of the new disk's characteristics. As far as the customers are concerned, they buy the disk, they plug it in, and it works. On some traditional systems, customers do need to be aware of the characteristics of these new devices. They may even need disk specialists or people who are aware of the characteristics of these devices so that they know what data to put where for performance and for other reasons. On AS400 there are disk specialists, but they are all in Rochester, Minnesota. And as far as the customer is concerned, he just plugs it in and it works. Storage management can be left entirely to the machine. And for the vast majority of AS400 customers, this is exactly how they want their machines to run. I have an analogy that you might find useful for single-level storage. It's of someone working in a traditional library, and there are bookshelves behind me here, and here in front of me is my little desk at which I work. The bookshelves correspond to disk storage, and my little desk here corresponds to main storage. On a conventional machine, I need to have a knowledge of the storage devices, the bookshelves, and of the filing system. And I need to know what books are where and how I use things like stepladders to access those books. And then, having found a book, I bring it back to my little desk in order to work on it. But somebody somewhere needs to know about bookshelves, filing systems, stepladders, and so on. Now, on AS400 with single-level storage, the principles are the same, but it is as if I have a super efficient librarian. And in order to use something, all I have to do is name it, and it appears immediately in front of me. For example, I may say Newton's Principia, and Newton's Principia appears. Or I may say Fox's Book of Martyrs, and Fox's Book of Martyrs appears. Or I may say Kama Sutra, and Kama Sutra has appeared. Oh yes, that's what I want. Oh, well, I'll take a look at that later on, but before I forget, we do happen to use on AS400 a 48-bit pointer to point at data regardless of where it resides. And what this means is that the maximum amount of data that you can address on an AS400 is restricted by that. The maximum is 2 to the 48, and if your binary arithmetic is quick, that works out at 281 million bytes or characters of data. In fact, one of the books I was reading recently on AS400 worked out that 281 million bytes of data was equivalent, or was enough, to keep track of the information contained on 140 trillion pages, which was the equivalent of a stack of paper over 13 million miles high, and that would stretch between the Earth and the Moon 50 times over. Now, you might say, my business is doing very well, and my business plans are extremely optimistic, but an increase in my data volumes to that amount would certainly take me by surprise. Have you gone mad, IBM? What it's worth remembering here is that when IBM brought out its System 360 machines in 1964, it used 24-bit addressing, and it was inconceivable in those days that anyone would require more data than what 24 bits allowed them to address. They did, and it was a major upheaval to move from one size address space to another. Now, what the clever people in IBM are saying here with 48-bit addressing is that we have to set the ceiling somewhere. Let us set it absurdly high by today's standards, and then hope to goodness that we never reach it. What this is positioning us for is information-intensive applications such as image, where you want to store pictures or drawings, for example, or voice. You may, for example, wish to annotate a piece of text that you've just typed with your own voice, so that when somebody reads your note, you're able to nag them simultaneously. And both image and voice, when they take off, will have colossal storage requirements. What we're saying on AS400 is that architecturally, we are ready for them. One final word, whilst on the subject of storage and on AS400's future-oriented design. If we were ever to find that direct access to 281 trillion bytes of storage was a bit of a constraint, then we could extend our 48-bit addressing to 64-bit addressing. And this change would be transparent to the operating system and to the application software. So to summarize, single-level storage allows the customer to leave storage management entirely to the machine, and it also positions us perfectly for emerging information-intensive applications such as voice and image. The fourth concept that we need to look at is that of a hierarchy of microprocessors. I'd like to start this section by saying a few words about MIPS. MIPS stands for a million instructions per second, and is sometimes used as an indicator of a processor's power, the speed with which it executes instructions. The power of a processor is important, but equally important is what that processor means by an instruction, and in turn, just as important as that, is what sort of work it is that you are buying the processor for. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. Supposing that you wanted to buy a robot to help you do the housework, and you went to a shop that sold robots, and you were shown Robot A and Robot B. Robot A had a speed of 10 MIPS, and Robot B had a speed of just 1 MIP. Now you might think that your mind was automatically made up for you. Surely Robot A at 10 MIPS is the one to buy. But as we shall see in a minute, it is not. How do you check this out? You check it out in the way that you should always check things out. You forget the fancy MIPS and you remember what you are buying the machine for, in this case to hoover your carpets and water your petunias. And you would apply the following test. Give both robots a hoover. This is the main workload, after all, that you have in mind for these machines. And what do you find? Robot B, the 1 MIP robot, has hoovered all your carpet so quickly that it has now had time to bake you a cake and to make you a cup of tea. But Robot A hasn't even moved. How could that be? Robot A had a 10 MIP processor as opposed to Robot B's 1 MIP processor. It happened because Robot A and Robot B had different views as to what constituted an instruction. In order for Robot A to move, it had to execute a very long series of its instructions, like this: open I1, open I2, receive visual data from I1, receive visual data from I2, coordinate visual data from both eyes, tilt head down by 1 millimeter, check balance, have I fallen over? If not, activate motors to leg 1, activate motors to leg 2, move leg 1 forward 1 millimeter, check balance, have I fallen over? And so on. A lot of instructions. These are what Robot A meant by instructions. No wonder it needed a 10 MIP processor. It had to execute 50,000 instructions just to see if it was sitting down. Now let's look at Robot B's instruction set. Oh, Hoover. And that's it. It executes one instruction and it achieves precisely the outcome we want. Obviously, my little analogy simplifies things slightly, but it does make the point that you must never be dazzled by fancy MIPs. You must never lose sight of what it is that you're buying the machine for, and then ask to see the machine doing precisely that job of work. That little analogy should have made it clear as to what sort of questions we should ask when somebody brandishes their MIPs at us. I first came across a request to quote MIPs on AS400 right at the beginning of AS400's life. It was at its announcement in 1988. I was talking at the AS400 announcement meeting we held in Birmingham, and there was a heckler in my audience who kept interrupting me, asking me, "What's your MIPs then?" At first I used the time-honored device for dealing with interruptions during set-piece presentations. I ignored him, but then after the third interrupt I thought, oh, maybe this is a cry for help, and maybe I really should answer his question. So I asked, I said, what is it you are planning to use the machine for? Are you evaluating the Schrödinger wave equation and the Mandelbrot polynomials whilst simultaneously controlling a robot that is performing open heart surgery? Are you designing an enhancement to the space shuttle? Or are you running payroll? We must never lose sight of what it is that we want a machine to do. AS400 is designed for and optimized for the general business environment, and every aspect of its design reflects that. And the general business environment is one in which we are doing fairly simple things to a very large amount of data. In other words, it is input-output intensive or I/O intensive rather than compute intensive. Compute intensive is where you are doing complex things to a much smaller amount of data. Compute intensive is what goes on in the engineering and scientific environment. Let's now take a look at what we mean by AS400's hierarchy of microprocessors. Here is the main processor, and here is main storage. A program, as you know, has first to arrive in main storage before the processor can execute it. At some point in the program, it is going to ask for an I/O operation to be performed, for example, a record to be read from a file on disk. And that I/O operation takes an extremely long time in data processing terms, and the way that AS400 handles that is for the request for the I/O to be delegated to another processor in charge of that particular I/O device, the microprocessor in charge of the disk in this example. Meanwhile, the main processor gets on with another program and will only return its attention to the original program when the data it had requested earlier has been fetched from disk and put into main storage by the disk microprocessor. And all I/O devices, not only disks but also workstations and communication lines, all have their own processors on an AS400. And on the largest AS400 that you can buy, you can have several hundred processors, which makes quoting MIPs look rather silly. Because what do? Do you add all the MIPs together? Do you multiply them? No. You just remember that AS400 is optimized for an I/O intensive environment. In other words, the general business environment. Two final points. First, the microprocessors we use on AS400 are made by various outside vendors, people like Intel and Motorola. And what this type of design means is that when, for example, Intel or Motorola bring out a new chip, we can quickly integrate it into this part of the machine and rapidly pass on the benefits to our customers with no disruption. The microprocessor is on an adapter card which you plug into the machine. And the second and final point is this. The main processor on an AS400 is a CISC processor. CISC stands for Complex Instruction Set Computer. The instructions that form this CISC processor are chosen very carefully. We do this by looking at the instructions in programs written specifically for business applications, and by noting which instructions it is that occur frequently in that environment, and by putting those instructions into the instruction set, into the silicon. And what that means is that an AS400 processor in a commercial processing environment accomplishes what is required far more quickly and efficiently than a processor that has an instruction set that is not optimized for that environment. And now the final architectural point, and that is the operating system, OS400. If someone were to ask me to describe AS400 in just one sentence, I would find that very difficult to do. But the sentence I would choose would be this, that the single most dramatic thing about AS400 is that its operating system, OS400, is conceived as a single entity, with everything that you can think of and a lot that you can't think of already integrated into it. Let's examine this further. The traditional design of machines, and most IBM machines are like this, is such that you buy the hardware, and then you buy the basic operating system to run that hardware. Before you get the functionality you need, however, you also need other items of software. For example, the software to provide you with support for a relational database, software to provide you with support for an interactive environment, and software to support various communications environments, software to provide security, and so on. And there may be between 11 and 25 different modules of software that will need to be integrated to give you the functionality you need for your business. And often these modules come from different vendors, and you have to check that the latest version of this module from this vendor works with the current version of the other modules you have. And you also need to check that this module, for example, will map to ASCII keyboards in the same way that this one does. And you will need people with sufficient technical knowledge and expertise to ask all these questions and to do all this work. I say all that because on AS400 there is none of that. All the components I've just spoken about, and there are many more too, are all integrated into AS400's operating system, OS400. OS400 fully integrates all the software needed for a general business environment. If you imagine a situation where you have a user who is not particularly computer literate, and most users are in that category, and so they should be because the machine exists to help them, and imagine that after 8 hours work, this user sends some printout to the printer. He knows it has gone to the printer because a message came to his screen telling him that. But when he goes over to the printer device, he notices that his work has not actually printed out, and this is after 8 hours work. After 8 hours work, we reckon that he may not be in the mood for asking for help in computer jargon, and he may want to type in the first thing that comes into his mind. AS400 has an indexed help facility which will look through his request for help to see if there is an entry in the database. The important thing is that the user has asked for help in his own words. And AS400 responds by giving just 1 or 2 paragraphs of help text relevant to his problem. Other machines also have online help text, but a lot of other machines tend to say to you, "You asked for help, did you? Here's 100 gigabytes of it, you find the bit you want." But AS400 doesn't do that. It goes straight to the paragraphs of text that are relevant to you. So, to summarize, what does this operating system concept give us? OS400 is an operating system that is designed as a single entity, fully integrating all the components needed in a general business environment. This means that you don't need specialist technicians to do the large amount of integration that is fundamental to a business system. It has already been done by IBM. Installation, development, and maintenance costs are much, much lower than in other, less integrated environments. Also, this high level of integration of software components means that software developers who are writing application software know that when they write for AS400, they can take its wide range of constituent software components for granted, as standard, as part of AS400. And this is one of the factors that meant that long before AS400 was even 3 years old, there were well over 10,000 good commercial applications available on it worldwide. And so, to summarize everything, we have looked at each of the 5 architectural principles in turn and seen what each means to the businessman buying this machine. No other single system on Earth has all 5 of these architectural principles on a single machine or implemented as fully as they are on AS400. The principles explain why it is that we can say that AS400 has a future-oriented architecture. And this is a crucial consideration for the protection of a customer's investment. AS400 combines large system capability with small system friendliness. This means that a customer can support a very large number of commercial users at a fraction of the cost of providing the same service on a different architecture machine. And for customers who require their AS400 to operate in a mixed environment of IBM and non-IBM products, AS400, through providing a range of products that conform to industry standards, successfully combines the benefits of both IBM standards and of openness based on industry standards. AS400, as we have seen, is designed as a total system, fully integrating all the hardware and software components needed in a general business environment. It is designed for business, and it is optimized for business in a way that no other machine is. And that fundamental consideration, that it is a general-purpose business computer, pervades every aspect of its design. This presentation should have convinced you of that. It should also have convinced you that we are fully justified in calling the AS400 the best architecture in the world.